1953, Moscow. A car approached a small mansion on Malonikitskaya Street. Out of it appeared Colonel Korotkov and several servicemen. The colonel showed the guards his ID of the USSR Interior Ministry. "Secret documents. I must deliver them personally. Come in." Korotkov and the soldiers entered the cabinet. Before them sat a man in pince nez. He immediately knew why these people had come to him. He rushed to the briefcase and pulled out a gun. At that moment, the military men opened fire. People in the street stopped when they heard shooting in the mansion. In the cabinet, however, it was all over. Soldiers quickly covered the body with canvas and loaded it into the car. So without a trial, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, had been killed. He'd been the most influential person in the country, the main contender to the throne, recently vacated by Stalin. He was killed on the orders of Khrushchev, with the support of Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich. They were pushed into murder by an animalistic fear of Beria. They saw in him shades of the late Stalin. A brutal executioner responsible for taking more than 600,000 lives. It was he who in 1937 organized the most atrocious repression in the USSR. He had legalized torture and executed prisoners without trial. Under his rule, the NKVD had become the most powerful institution in the state. He was regarded as all-powerful. He was feared by the entire country, even by Stalin himself. But no one knew that Beria also lived in fear. For him, every day might be his last. And to survive, Beria had to fight, to plot, and to kill. And he was guided not by desire to gain favor or even a lust for power. "We will remove weeds and plow up Georgia." But fear was taken to absurd levels. (1921), Baku. He was looking at the men who'd been taken from the house. He knew what would happen next. Soldiers would put them against the wall. There would be a command to pull the trigger. Young Beria was the last in a row of those who were to shoot. He was looking at the people near the wall, but didn't want to kill any of them. His finger trembled on the trigger. But there was no command. Lavrenti's knees were giving way. He simply couldn't kill a man. A wave of horror swept over his body. Only one question stuck in his head. Why? (1918), Baku. Bloodstained, he was sitting in the cabinet and couldn't understand what was going on. Why were they beating him? What did these people want? Lavrenti Beria, a young architect and excellent student, couldn't answer these questions. Sometime before, he had received a diploma, and along with it, a long-awaited chance to finally get out of poverty. He had been determined to succeed. As a child, Lavrenti painted amazing icons. Beria remembered showing these works to his father. Pavel Beria, amazed at his son's talents, sold half his house in order to send his boy to college. His father's faith paid off. First, Lavrenti graduated from Sukhumi School, then from a prestigious architectural technical school in Baku. He received his first order and was relieved to have a chance to bring his family out of poverty and to thank his father, who had sacrificed so much. In those days, the future seemed happy and carefree. Then one day, two men came up to him in the street. They showed him some paperwork. It was an offer to cooperate with the Bolshevik Party, which was leading a fierce struggle to gain power in the country. Its main opponent was the Musavat Nationalist Party, which proclaimed the idea of Azerbaijan's independence, and which for several years the Bolsheviks tried to unsuccessfully force out. Lavrenti didn't realize that he had been chosen deliberately. Among Beria's friends from the technical school were sympathizers of the Musavat Party. So the guy had to learn who they were. And to do this, he had to become a secret agent. They tried to persuade him, they beat him, but Lavrenti was adamant. And then strangers dragged him to the window. Beria froze in horror. In the yard, he saw his former classmate with his hands tied. Their eyes met for a moment. He was staring at the body of the man he had just shot. He had pulled the trigger. Beria didn't want to kill, but there was no other choice. He became a Chekist. What did it mean? Leather jacket, revolver, and food rations? Yes, but there was more to it than that. Being Chekist was all about surviving, and he was desperate to live. He knew it as he looked through the window at all those innocent people who had been executed. Suddenly, he had been seized by animal fear. Obeying this fear, Beria signed a hidden paper of cooperation, not realizing there would be no turning back.
Он был внедрен в мусаватистскую разведку.
He was filtered into the Muscovat Secret Service. In that part of Transcaucasia, which is now Azerbaijan, the Musavat Republic was formed. In this territory were Turkish forces, and Beria, filtered into their organization, was passing information to the Bolsheviks. Every time he pulled the trigger, he was convinced that it would be the last time. Soon they would let him go. And then it will all work out again. He will forget the nightmarish past. Eventually, due to the efforts of secret agents, the Bolsheviks managed to seize power in Azerbaijan. In 1922, the country joined the USSR. Beria had completed his mission, but no one was going to let him go. 1924, Soviet Georgia. Beria would remember that day for the rest of his life. He, a young Chekist, had the great honor of pouring wine during a party of prominent Bolsheviks in Georgia. The people who gathered around the table had made a revolution in Georgia. They rightly considered themselves its creators. And now, they were receiving a guest from Moscow. Everyone considered the guest an upstart who had made his career murdering people. And now he came to bring the order in Georgia. As Beria was pouring the wine, his hand trembled. Beria met the man's eyes. It was Stalin. Beria felt the man's immense power. Stalin raised his glass and made a toast. There is a great deal of weed in Georgia. It is therefore necessary to plow up Georgia. A heavy silence descended over the table. All those Bolsheviks realized that the next day, they too might be called the weed. Beria also understood this. A chill swept over his body. This was his chance. It's now or never. We will remove weed and plow up Georgia. He drank his wine and put the empty glass on the table. Everything went dark. Lavrenti didn't seem to notice Stalin's fixed gaze. He didn't see the strict faces of the masters at the table. The next day, Stalin left, and Beria was appointed deputy head of the Cheka in Georgia. Such a prompt promotion surprised everyone. To the old Bolsheviks in Georgia, Beria was an outsider, an upstart, and they started to hate him. But Beria didn't care. He has gained a powerful patron, almost a soulmate, Comrade Stalin. Lavrenti felt happy. The new appointment revived the old Beria. A quiet, reasonable man who for some time forgot about the former dream for the sake of a new one. To justify the trust placed in him, to take care of his safety, finally to prove himself. Beria enthusiastically took to his work. He tracked down spies and sent them to prison. As an architect, he was implementing his most ambitious project, the building of a new state without blood or senseless murders, unlike neighboring Russia. It was an amazing period in Lavrenti's life. He bought back his father's house and began to earn huge amounts of money. But then came a telegram from Moscow. Comrade Stalin was not pleased with the work of the Georgian Cheka. For Beria, it was a death sentence. He was seized by fear. Lavrenti was in despair. Stalin did not appreciate his efforts. At the same time, Beria's colleagues in Moscow executed several hundred spies and enemies of the Soviet rule a week. The Georgian Cheka didn't show even half of these amounts. Stalin wasn't interested in reasons for this. The General Secretary demanded victims, and Beria gave them to him. (1924), Georgia. He was standing against the wall, terrified, afraid to look into the people's eyes. He didn't need to wait for orders. He now gave the orders. Rumor has it that in Georgia, repressions were even more severe than in other regions of the Soviet Union. Beria was like a mini Stalin. In Moscow, Stalin controls the course of repressions, inflicts resolutions on interrogations and protocols, gives advice on whom to beat and whom to interrogate intensively. Beria does exactly the same in the Transcaucasia. In my opinion, even Baragov, an Azerbaijani, was more reserved, and it was hard for Stalin not to notice this. Beria was fulfilling what he had promised. He became the hands with which Stalin removed Georgian weeds. Fire! He could not get used to this sound. He would wake in the middle of the night, terrified. In his dreams, he saw innocent people being shot without trial. He couldn't sleep. Nightmares were driving Lavrenti crazy. And then one night, stupefied by blood, insomnia and fatigue, Beria decided enough. The head of the Cheka was reading an application. Beria was asking to be allowed to study in the Polytechnic Institute in Baku. He didn't want to be a Chekist. He wanted to live. He had married and wanted to rebuild his life. Lavrenti knew that he might not get out of this room. His young wife waiting outside also knew this. Beria watched his boss with horror. He carefully placed the paper on the table, picked up a pen, and raised his eyes. Lavrenti was rooted to the spot. He won't give up, whatever the cost. The chief was looking at him, long and hard. And then, with a sharp stroke of the pen, put his signature under the application. Lavrenti couldn't believe his eyes. They let him go. Silently, without any conditions, the world had changed. It became brighter and more colorful. He hugged his wife. Finally, there was no need to be afraid. He can realize his dream of becoming an architect and eventually, perhaps, to forget the horrors of the past. He was playing football with the boys in the yard. He was shouting and laughing like a child. Finally, a terrible burden fell from his shoulders. His wife was hanging out the washing and smiling, looking at her husband. Their lives were looking up. At first, he didn't notice the black car coming up to the house. Lavrenti stopped playing with the ball. Beria knew something terrible was going to happen. He realized with horror that these people would never let him go. All his dreams were in vain. There is no turning back. He didn't want his family to see them. The arrival of the black car was a bad sign. Lavrenti hastily kissed his confused wife and sat in the car. He stared out of the window. His world was in retreat, and all because of the hated system. Beria didn't know that in several years he would become the embodiment of this system. A brutal executioner who in 1937 would kill 600,000 people with one stroke of a pen. A bloody monster who would be murdering people with his own hands, without fear or pangs of conscience. And now he was staring out of the car window, saying goodbye to the carefree world of fun and children's dreams, to which he would never return. Later on, Lavrenti learned that the head of Cheka signed only a small vacation permit, and that no one was going to let Beria go. He was simply too valuable. It was the mid-20s. The old Bolsheviks in the Georgian government didn't accept Stalin as leader, and the General Secretary could only establish his authority with reliable and trusted people. Lavrenti Beria found himself on that list. Eventually, Stalin saw in Beria a reliable executioner, a man he could order about like most of his other men, with a reputation that may have been considered tarnished. Take Vyshinsky, higher Menshevik, who wrote out the order for Lenin's arrest. At any time, Stalin could simply crush him by accusing him for writing that order. The same was true for Beria. 1931, Georgia. He was walking through the CC long corridors. The cabinet doors were closed. The telephones wouldn't stop ringing. There was nobody else there. The sound of a phone ringing in the empty building brought him to his new cabinet. The cabinet of the Secretary of the Georgian Communist Party CC. This was a considerable advance, a huge leap in the career of a young Chekist. But was Beria in fact pleased? No, Stalin's man was hated here. That day, in protest against Beria's appointment, no one went to work. Soon, these people would pay dearly for their action. Beria himself would make sure of it. He wasn't the naive, good-natured architect anymore, but Lord's punishing sword, Stalin's right hand. With the leader's consent, Beria ordered the execution of the entire personnel of Georgia's government. So he fulfilled the precept of Stalin. Beria was no longer interested in the moral aspect of his work. However, while shooting and punishing, he was making more enemies. The hunt for the CC secretary's life had begun. There were several attempted murders, but Beria tried to ignore this fact. He forced himself not to be afraid. However, his fear grew. 1934, Lake Ritsa, Abkhazia. Two ordinary families were sitting by the side of a lake. Beria and his friend, the head of Abkhazia, Lakoba, rarely spent their weekend like this. Beria didn't hide his pleasure. He was enjoying these rare, carefree moments. Because of his work, he spent very little time with his family and became increasingly sullen and withdrawn. He couldn't talk to anyone about his worries. Most of all, Beria was afraid that someone would find out about his fear. On that night, Lakoba was tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep. In the distance, he could hear the sound of an engine. Lakoba came out of the tent. The noise stopped. He heard voices. It was a bad sign. Lakoba decided not to wait for what would happen next. He rushed to save his and his friend's family. Lavrenti, wake up! We must leave! Beria grabbed his wife and son. Under cover of darkness, they ran into the nearest ravine. Lavrenti didn't understand why they needed to hurry. What's the worst that could happen at night in a deserted area? Beria looked in horror at the place where a moment ago he had been peacefully sleeping with his family. The tent was riddled with bullets. Lavrenti trembled and turned white. He was seized by animal fear. He wanted to hide, to run away from danger. But where could he go? There was no safe place in Georgia. Everybody hated him, from the CC party members to ordinary citizens. But Moscow was another thing. A city where no one knew him, where he could disappear and work quietly, start all over again, and finally forget old fears which were driving him mad. 1934, Tbilisi. Opposite to him sat a woman. Her face was covered with bruises. She was crying, asking for pity. But Beria was adamant. He could no longer control himself. He felt no pity. This woman was an obstacle on his way to salvation, on his way to Moscow. I'm the author of this book. My husband is the author of this book. He hit her again and again. She grabbed the book and threw it at him. It was the last straw. A wave of anger overwhelmed him. He looked at the woman's body. He had killed her with his own hands. Without following someone else's order, he had killed her and felt nothing, neither pity nor fear. Like a heartless monster, he murdered a human being over a book. Here is this book. In 1935, in the USSR, it became a bestseller. Beria's work on the history of the Bolshevik organizations in Transcaucasia became Stalin's reference book. It proved that the General Secretary, who was on a par as Lenin, was the Bolsheviks' leader and father of the revolution. Officially, it was written by Lavrenti Beria, and no one could prove it to the contrary. A host of writers, headed by the Georgian historian Bibanishvili, was shot long before the publication, and the last witness had died in Beria's cabinet. Beria was certain that the publishing of the book would be his ticket to Moscow. The book appeared at a very convenient time. It was a special trump card that Beria could use. Comrade Stalin, look, I wrote about you. Is this all correct? Yes, Comrade Beria. Well done. Indeed, Stalin highly praised the work of his Georgian associate, but the leader wasn't in a hurry to invite him to the capital. The assassination attempts on the Georgian Chekist became more frequent. In despair and guided by the instinct of self-preservation, Beria would make the last and the most terrible sacrifice. 1936, Georgia. The two old friends, Lakoba and Beria, were in the theater. Everything was going well. But during the performance, Lakoba felt unwell and left before the final act. Beria stayed. He was admiring the graceful movements of the dancers. Beria was aware that he would never see his friend again. He knew that at that very moment, Lakoba was writhing around in agony. The man who had saved his life had now been poisoned by Beria's hand. Lakoba had signed his death warrant during his conversation with Stalin, where he had refused to organize new repressions in Georgia. But Beria could not refuse. He knew that heading the bloody slaughter in 1937 in Georgia would not only be his ticket to Moscow, but his only way to stay alive. wouldn't repeat Lakoba's mistake. What was Beria thinking while driving to Moscow? The fact that he had finally reached the top and become powerful? Or the fact that through his new position, he would bring benefit to the state? No, he was once again thinking of his own survival. Beria knew that the higher up the corporate ladder he climbed, the greater the risk to his life. But he could neither refuse nor disappoint Stalin, who had saved his life. The fact that he had consistently followed the party line showed that he was a devoted son of the Communist Party and therefore would be a reliable candidate for promotion in Moscow. As he had already proven, with blood, what he was capable of. Stalin appreciated this. Beria knew that only the strongest would survive in the Kremlin menagerie. He was staring out of the car window at a huge field where several farmers were fertilizing the earth with ashes. He was afraid that he too would one day turn to ash. Beria could easily manage the scenario. Being taken out of his house at night and forced into a car. Being beaten during interrogations and then shot. A car takes a barrel full of his ashes to this field where they are scattered. Nourishing the collective farm with their ashes was Stalin's way to deal with Lenin's former associates. He could do the same with anyone. Beria was afraid of the post, entrusted to him by Stalin. None of the previous NKVD chairmen had survived. The organization was previously led by Yagoda. Nikolai Yezhov executed Yagoda along with all of his men. Now, Beria was to clear the NKVD of Yezhov and his men. But Beria couldn't refuse. His gratitude to Stalin for his liberation from Georgia was stronger than the fear of being killed. Beria eagerly set to work, surpassing all his predecessors. During the bloody repressions of 1937 in the USSR alone, more than 600,000 people were executed under Beria's orders. Beria was a reliable executor. He carried out the most bloody and atrocious acts, not to mention the massacring of Poles in 1940 at Katyn. A monstrous act. Execution without trial of more than 22,000 people, prisoners of war and civilians.
Когда он видел, как работает Берия, когда он оценивал его различные действия,
when he saw how Beria worked, he realized that this man would do any of his dirty work for him. For example, to eliminate the head of the Polish army, or to eliminate people for no reason. So thousands of innocent people were killed at Stalin's behest by Comrade Beria, who was extremely afraid of disappointing his leader. June 21st, 1941, Moscow. He was afraid to look into Stalin's eyes. A moment ago, Beria had received the latest intelligence report. The war was imminent, and he had to report this to the leader. But how? Stalin didn't even want to hear about it. He became furious every time he heard of Germany's attacks. Joseph Vissarionovich, the war will begin tomorrow. but we remember your words and feel sure that Hitler won't attack.
Гитлер не нападет.
Stalin looked at him. Beria was petrified. The leader got up and left the cabinet. Beria didn't dare move. He was expecting the worst. I believe that part of Stalin's political power came from his unpredictability. How will this man react? What will his next move be? At any moment, he was ready to use one of his many trump cards, the assassination of certain people. But something incredible happened. After the German invasion, the tyrant Stalin panicked. He stopped responding to calls and went to dacha. For a week, the country was left without leadership. Beria was amazed. He had never seen Stalin like this. He wouldn't tell anyone about their leader's terrible cowardice. Instead, Beria would take leadership of the country. He would create a united authority in the USSR for the period of the war, the State Defense Committee. Beria would visit Stalin and persuade him to hand over the leadership. In this way, he would save the tragic situation on the fronts of World War II. Beria was proud of his ingenuity. His services in the war would be a suitable thank you for Stalin's miraculous rescue. I don't see why people call a man like Beria manager. Above all, he was an executioner and a hangman. As a leader of the state security, he personally tortured, poisoned, and beat people under investigation in his cabinet. Of course, he always blamed Stalin. Beria became confident. The fear that had tormented him for so long had disappeared. Though he had lost connection with his family, though his wife was afraid of him and couldn't understand him, now he felt he had much more than just a family. He had boundless power, dozens of mistresses, and the patronage of the leader. Stalin was indebted to him for his salvation, and he was keen to show his gratitude. 1949, Moscow. The news received from Khrushchev of what happened at Stalin's dacha kept Beria awake at night. During dinner, the leader suddenly got up and called his two old friends to follow him into the bathroom. Stalin turned on the shower, looked around, and whispered,
Я перестал доверять Лаврентию.
Beria knew exactly what this meant. Stalin wanted him removed. But there was something else. Now, Beria realized that the tables had been turned. Stalin was now afraid of him. It was the final signal. Beria knew he could not wait any longer. After so many years of loyal service, Stalin wanted to get rid of him. But Beria would take brutal revenge for the fear that had followed him around for so many years. He would survive. He would make sure that the man who ruined his life would be dead. Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Bulganin gathered that evening and planned everything in detail. First, they needed to remove the leader's closest men, his personal secretary, Poskrebyshev, and his security chief, General Vlasic. Then, at another dinner at the dacha, Stalin must suffer a stroke that would kill him immediately, leaving no chance of survival. Stalin must die in front of witnesses. Also, there must be doctors and children. The plan was agreed, and they began to act. 1953. Stalin's dacha. The day had come. All the conspirators gathered at Stalin's dacha in Kuntsevo. Beria seemed jolly. He was smiling and joking. Years spent in fear made him a wonderful actor. However, inside, another fear was growing. Any of the conspirators could be a traitor, and then it would be his end. At the table, there was a playful atmosphere. Stalin was smiling and puffing his pipe. Beria was watching his every move. He noticed his leader had suddenly become gloomy. The poison was working. Stalin got up from the table. He said goodnight to the guests, complaining of fatigue. Beria went after him. It was I who first claimed that Stalin had been poisoned back in 2001 in my first book. Today, there are stories telling that they analyzed Stalin's medical history. They consulted doctors and found out that there was poison in his blood. He was standing outside the door, listening to the man wheezing behind the wall. Nearby stood a frightened Khrushchev. A medical team had been waiting all day for Beria's permission to enter the leader's bedroom. He didn't leave the door for a minute. Beria felt wide awake. With fear and delight, he was awaiting the end. Beria was looking at Stalin's face, seeing not a human, but his own fear. And now, this fear was dying in front of him. Here it was. The moment had come. Beria could hardly hold back his inner triumph. He had won his long battle. Krustalev, a car! Krustalev was Stalin's personal driver, and he didn't obey Beria. Beria was no longer afraid. Now, he was the personification of that fear to others. In his order given to Krustalev, there was an open claim to the empty throne. However, Beria was not destined to get it. (10 a.m., June 28, 1953, Moscow. It was a usual working morning. He was sitting in his cabinet. It had been 2 months since Stalin's death, and Beria had a lot of plans. He was preparing a huge transformation in the country. That morning, he was in a wonderful mood. He was the only member of the CC Presidium who openly expressed his joy of Stalin's death. This, of course, was an indiscretion, because he had to understand that the leaders, his other associates, still idolized Stalin. And, of course, they saw him as an enemy. He felt that his life had just begun. He didn't notice a car approaching the house or the people getting out of it. Secret documents. I must deliver them personally. Come in. The doors opened with a bang. Armed servicemen ran into the cabinet. Beria realized that his former allies had betrayed him. He rushed for the gun in his briefcase, but it was too late. People in the street stopped when they heard the gunshot in the mansion. In the cabinet, it was all over. The official history says that Beria had a long trial and only then was shot as a state criminal. In fact, he died 6 months before his documented date of death. Beria's murder was staged this way. The Presidium of the CC was informed that there was data incriminating Beria of the organization of armed conspiracy. They needed to invite Beria to the Presidium and interrogate him. What if Beria refused to come to the Presidium? Khrushchev ordered to send 2 generals to bring Beria to the Presidium. When the generals returned, they informed them that Beria had resisted and therefore had been killed. They declared that Beria had been arrested and there was an ongoing investigation. But Beria was already dead. His body was buried in the Lubyanka's courtyard, along with all his personal belongings. All except the desperate fear that was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of innocent people.